Research Center public lecture by Professor Susan Thornton of Yale Law School. I'm Han Chaolu, Professor of History at Georgia Tech and the Director of the China Research Center. So before we start, I would like to say a few words about the center. The China Research Center was founded in 2001 by Professor Penny, Prime, an economist who is with us today, actually. So we have been here for almost 20 years. The center is an inter-university organization with mission to provide a platform for China-related research and teaching in Atlanta and in the broad region of the Southeast. So we draw much of our expertise from the universities and institutes around the region. Our associates are mostly from the 13 universities and colleges in the region. The center is currently housed in the School of History and Sociology of Georgia Tech's Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts, and financially supported by Georgia Tech, the Henry Luce Foundation, and other institutes of private sector. The center published an online journal called China Currents, which also has a paperback version available on Amazon.com. Among many things we do at the center is to invite prominent China scholars and experts to give a public lecture like we are going to have today. So without further ado, I will let my colleague, Dr. Yawei Liu, who is Senior Advisor on China at the Carter Center, and also our center's Associate Director, to introduce our speaker and to moderate today's event. So Yawei, please.
Thank you, Han Chao. I'm Yawei Liu. I'm the Senior Advisor on China at the Carter Center. It's an honor and privilege to moderate today's discussion. I will introduce Penny Prime first, and then I will introduce our primary main speaker, Susan Thornton, second. So Penny Prime went to China in 1976. That's the year when Mao died. That's the year when the Gang of Four was overthrown. That's the year of Dragon. That's the year that China finally ended the nightmare of the great proletarian cultural revolution. Penny was one of the first to conduct her graduate study research on dissertation in China. And then I came here, I saw Penny teaching at the Kennesaw State, and then she taught at Mercer University, and then she taught at Georgia State. And finally, she taught at Duke Kunshan University. And as Han Chao mentioned, she founded the China Center. So we're going to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the center next year. You know, without her, we're not going to have this talk here. So Penny today will have, after Susan's presentation, she will have a conversation with Susan. I'm going to introduce Susan unconventionally, not to talk about her career, but to talk about my encounter with Susan. Back in 2005, that's 15 years ago, Susan traveled with the Carter Center delegation to Guizhou, and then from Guizhou to Chengdu, and finally to the Yangtze Delta to Jiangsu. That's when the Carter Center was monitoring village elections in China, and were also involved in training people's delegates. And that's when I got to know Susan. And before Susan, it was Fort Hart, and after Susan, it was Dan Quittenbrink. Fort Hart, of course, as you know, retired after he served as Consul General in Hong Kong, and Dan now is ambassador in Vietnam. And then in 2015, when Susan still at the State Department, she came to the Carter Center and attended our forum on US-China relationship. I think at that time, she was assistant, deputy assistant secretary. And then in 2018, Susan literally saved my career at the Carter Center. You probably don't know, is we planned a meeting in Djibouti, all basically in coordination with AFRICOM. But by the time we were about to start the meeting, AFRICOM notified us saying, Pentagon just notified us, we're not going to be able to go to the meeting. So therefore, we also tell you not even to have the meeting in Djibouti. We already spent a lot of money, book all the ticket and all of that. So at last moment, I wrote to Susan, I said, here is the issue. We're about to have the meeting, Pentagon backed out. We do need American government representation so that to make it a trilateral cooperation meeting. And I don't know what Susan did. So I just received the email from Larry Andre, American ambassador to Djibouti, who said, I was just authorized by Yamamoto to go to your meeting. So that finally saved the day and saved my career. I'm pretty sure the center probably will fire me, after we spend all that money booking all the tickets and the meeting is not going to materialize. And of course, a year earlier, you traveled, I saw you on TV, you traveled with Secretary Tillerson to China. Now you were at all the meetings, so you know a lot about this administration and its China policy making. And finally, 2019, Susan, after he started running a farm in May, she came to the center and attended our meeting to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the normalization. So my encounter with Susan actually is also a reflection on the rise and the fall of the relationship. And this relationship has gone through a lot in the past 40 years, and Susan is going to give all of us a very good description, the saga of the relationship. So Susan, run with it.
Well, thank you, Yahweh. I thought you were going to talk about the rise and fall of my career, but I'm glad that you talked about the rise and fall of the U.S.-China relationship. Let me just start by thanking everyone for tuning in and thanking the China Center for having me. I think this is a pivotal time for our country and for the world. And one of the clear central questions of this pivotal time is, how is the U.S. going to coexist with China in the world? I take it as a given that neither one of us is going anywhere, the U.S. or China. And I take it as a given, as Henry Kissinger mentioned again earlier this week at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, that it is not in U.S. or Chinese interest to end up in a conflict. So this means that we need to find a modus vivendi that recognizes our respective interests and tries to find a way to reconcile them, or at least keep those interests that are in tension or conflict from leading to a war. So I spent, as Yahweh mentioned, many years as a U.S. diplomat working on China. And I know that this is possible, but it is extremely hard work, and it requires a lot of focus and a lot of support, and not just support from our government or our official institutions, but support from people around the United States and actually around the world, because this relationship is that big. And it's very complicated. I like to turn first to where we stand on the U.S.-China relationship now at the end of the Trump administration. First, let me say, I don't think that U.S. foreign policy has gotten everything right, especially in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, which happens to coincide with my career in the diplomatic service. And we can come back to that. But I do think that President Trump and his people, when they came in, they sensed that there were some problems in U.S. foreign policy, and they wanted to make corrections. And I would say that, to be fair, two broad things that Trump and his people did with respect to China policy were actually helpful in this. First, of course, Trump and his people garnered a lot of attention to the way in which China was, flouting international rules and gaming the global trading and commerce system, sort of undermining the competitiveness of the US and particularly other developed economies. And this problem certainly cannot be laid all at China's feet. And if we do that, we may end up actually not making the changes that we need to make at home. But certainly China's behavior needed to be addressed in a concerted way. And President Trump got China's attention. The second thing that I think was good about the Trump approach to China is that President Trump was focused like a laser on this trade issue. And he did not become distracted by other issues in the US-China relationship. Now, some would say this is bad because maybe China got a free pass on issues like human rights or other things. There are a lot of issues in the US-China relationship, of course. But I think there are, certain upsides to prioritization and clear focus. Because if you get into a lot of other issues, then things can just swirl around and the talks drag on and nothing gets done. It's much easier for a counterpart in a negotiation to just prolong the discussion if you're not able to focus and bear down on the issues you're trying to prioritize. So I think that was another good thing about the Trump approach. Unfortunately, though, the negatives in President Trump's approach far outweighed, in my view, and undercut the positives. So problem number one was really kind of a lack of strategy. The China policy was more like an attitude, a kind of art of the deal leverage building, if you will, to continually, think up measures to press against China in order to build up leverage for the negotiation on trade. It wasn't really a very coherent framework for dealing with a complex relationship like China. Second, the unilateralism has been, I think, remarked upon widely as a big problem. You need pressure from others that have the same kinds of concerns that you have so that you can build a united approach and a common kind of pressure strategy to try to maximize your leverage and get what you want. Third, there was a lot of ill discipline in messaging. And, we have the famous Twitter account, which is part of the issue, but also just lots of stray voltage coming from all kinds of different people in the administration. Many Trump officials were making the Chinese leadership a target for regime change, which was undercutting the negotiations that they were trying to have on the trade deal and certainly undercutting the Chinese negotiators in that deal. And of course, in the end, President Trump saw the need to blame China for all of his problems during his re-election campaign and really ramped up this kind of transparently, I think, self-serving demonization campaign against China in order to sort of obscure other problems that were coming up in the context of the campaign. So this is really where things stand currently. I think it must be said that permanent damage has been done to the US-China relationship. And we will have to deal with that going forward. But I don't think it's possible now to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, on things like calling for regime change in China or calling for sort of the delegitimation of the Chinese government, which in fact is the authority and power that we now have to deal with on problems where we need China's help. So those problems and the notion in China that the US now is really out to undercut and block China's development going forward, China's economic development, China's rise, is another thing that now, I think it was always there, a little bit maybe left unsaid, but now that it's been said, it's much more indelible. Of course, I'm not implying that China is blameless in the deterioration of this relationship. China claims that the US is its most important overseas relationship, and yet it has made little effort in recent years to address any of the US concerns. In particular, in the last decade, since the great financial crisis, I think China's concerning behavior has escalated in terms of, rollback of reform and economic opening, domestic repression and intolerance of criticism. And I think China has been closing really to the outside world. These factors, I think, in tandem with a more aggressive and militaristic foreign policy, have given rise to major concerns about China's future trajectory in the world. How will it behave in the world as its power grows? So now we turn to the question of what can the Biden administration do about all of this? I think, and I worked in the Obama administration, as Yahweh mentioned, I was a career foreign service officer. So I served, I think, 9 different Secretary of States of both parties. And I did work in the Obama administration and have some familiarity with where Joe Biden, or how he views China and how he views international relations in general. And I think he has a very realistic and balanced view, personally, of the China challenge. I could see his influence in the Obama administration. Of course, Obama was not very experienced in foreign policy matters. Joe Biden, as vice president, had been the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair intermittently in the Senate while he was there, so had a lot of foreign policy experience. And you could see his influence in, for example, efforts to get China to do more in the way of providing public goods to the international system, things like peacekeeping, the Ebola response. You saw, I think, Biden's influence in the efforts to push back on trade problems, in addressing cyber intrusions and challenges, and in pushing back on China's island building in the South China Sea, et cetera. So Biden is a defender of the international system. He believes in democracy and openness, I think, and finds Beijing's system of governance and many of its practices objectionable, for sure, and frustrating. But he wants to change China's behavior, not block or contain China's growth, and not to try to run China from Washington, D.C., or overturn the governing authority in China. He wants to avoid war. And I think, this is a very sort of pragmatic picture. I think Biden would like to be able to harness cooperation with China to help him on some major catastrophes that he's faced with, including the pandemic, climate change, and probably other transnational issues. And he realizes he needs to deal with the second largest economy in the world if we want to proceed with our economic recovery coming out of the pandemic. And he understands the need to work with others to sort of maximize pressure and leverage on China in order to try to affect China's behavior and decision-making in the way that we'd like to see. However, cooperation with China is very difficult to sell now publicly in the United States. And it's also going to be pretty low down on the list of Joe Biden's priorities when he comes into office. And he's listed those, the getting out of this pandemic is job 1, 2, and 3. Having some kind of economic recovery, addressing U.S. healthcare systems, addressing racial inequality and discrimination, and dealing with the threat of climate change. And none of these are strictly foreign policy issues per se. But I think the likelihood of divided government coming in the future, and you all in Georgia have something to say about that apparently, but it's likely that we'll have divided government, and that probably means that domestic priorities are going to be difficult to prosecute, and that may mean that Biden will look to some early foreign policy wins to show that he's moving his agenda forward. I think he will try to leverage some COVID stimulus for getting some of his domestic priorities moving, but I think that will be difficult. So he'll move out quickly to try to show U.S. leadership in the international system. I think he'll rejoin multilateral institutions, starting with the WHO, probably prolong the arms agreement with the Russians, the New START treaty that's about to expire. He'll rejoin the Paris Accord, things that we've all heard about. And I think, much has been made of this effort also to try to get, our allies on board for a united front against China, sort of hold a summit of democracies, if you will. And I think, this is understandable. And we talked about the problems of Trump's unilateralism. So this could be useful if it injects some kind of lift into the performance and competence demonstrated of democracies and the development of kind of a coherent assessment of how to reform the international system. But I think if a big summit of like-minded countries, democracies, focuses solely on China, it's not going to be successful and not going to achieve the goals it set out to achieve. I don't know if the Biden administration is going to avoid the mistake of making the U.S.-China relationship into an ideological contestation or not. I don't think that's what Biden wants to do, but he does need a story so that he can get resources for what he wants to do out of Congress for things like research and development money, innovation, infrastructure building, et cetera. And so this is a narrative that's out there that everyone talks about how this is the bipartisan consensus, especially in Congress. So it may be deployed for that purpose. Of course, China wants to stabilize the relationship with the US, but this isn't the same as cooperating. And I think the drumbeat on China in the US will make it hard for Biden to concede much. And that will make it also hard for the Chinese to concede too much. I don't think China's going to be backtracking on Hong Kong or Xinjiang in the face of outside pressure. I think that probably will just stiffen their resolve. So I anticipate that the US-China diplomatic relationship under a Biden administration will restart slowly. I think Biden will be under pressure to continue negative Trump measures against China, especially from Congress. And I think the absence of any real counter message from US business and allies and other elements of the US public will make it difficult for him to really dramatically change course on this issue in the near term. I hope that through some more positive and pragmatic public statements, the new administration can signal that the US is returning to a path of diplomacy, that we're going to have a pragmatic attitude, that we're going to seek cooperation to overcome these challenges that face us, like the pandemic and the economy and climate. And I think, if we can do that, that will set us on a better path than the one we're on right now. But I think it's, we're in a hole and it's going to be a climb to get out of it. And we need to see effort, not just from the United States, but also from our Chinese counterparts to get things back on the right track. And maybe just as I close out my opening comments, just a quick advertisement or recommendation for further reading. I'm very proud of my Yale and Brookings Institution colleagues. We put out a long series of papers today with proposals on what the Biden administration could do to make improvements or for making progress in a number of the difficult areas in the US-China relationship, from human rights to economic issues to the South China Sea, et cetera. So if you're interested, you can look for that on the Brookings website. And I'll close it out there and hope I've helped you enough to inspire some tough questions.
Penny?
Okay, coming. There we go.
All right.
Okay, great. Susan, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that very valuable, balanced overview. The issues are clearly challenging. But let me start by asking you, you made the point that China's behavior internally and externally has tended to go, concerning behavior has increased, at least since the financial crisis, and more recently even with internal, and that Biden would like to change that behavior. Of course, changing China is always a fraught activity. But I want to ask you, why do you think these changes have happened within China? How can we understand from China's perspective what's happening, and therefore maybe we would have a better way to respond?
Well, I can try to answer that and get inside the heads of our counterparts in China, but I'd be curious as to your answer to this, since you've also spent a lot of time with Chinese counterparts. I do think that the great financial crisis, as we cleverly renamed it to deflect the origin away from ourselves, did give Chinese leaders a lot of pause and sort of changed kind of the way they looked out at the world and thought about what they were doing, as far as, kind of following the US model and integrating themselves into the international system. I think they saw more dangers than they had realized maybe were out there. And of course, the Chinese system has always been good at seeing dangers. It's a kind of a fragile, brittle, let's face it, governing system. I mean, Yahweh talked about what happened in 1976 and 1979, and it's been kind of ups and downs. And so I think, the system is very good at seeing dangers and overcorrecting, overcompensating for perceived dangers. And I think we've seen that really since the great financial crisis, probably, in not just the sort of rolling back of kind of the reform and opening agenda in the economy, but also, of course, the, repression against internal dissent. Of course, the sort of, a lot of this is being done under the cloak of kind of systematization and regularization. So, for example, you had the foreign NGO law that was passed. Mm-hmm. It was a long time in coming. They kept telling everyone it was coming, but nobody expected it to be as draconian and obviously aimed at making it very, very difficult for civil society organizations to operate in China as it was. Now, maybe we should have expected that, but I think that is, a reflection of many, many things that have happened, crackdowns on sort of rights lawyers in China and all kinds of other areas internally. Not to mention more recent developments, such as things happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So, if you look across the board, it really looks like there is a lot of worry. And of course, Xi Jinping constantly talks about how we're faced with the period of greatest change not seen in 100 years. And that's not a good thing, I don't think, from where they sit. I mean, they are busy kind of building up defenses, seeing threats and trying to prevent them from coming to any closer to the doorstep, that kind of thing. And this, I think, explains a lot about how the US-China relationship has developed in the last 10 years, actually.
Well, when we look at it from, an economic development point of view, and go back to Hu Jintao and the beginning of indigenous innovation and the reforms or investments that were being done starting then and going forward, a lot of it makes sense in terms of building capabilities, right? In terms of, you move up the value chain. Of course, you want to be able to produce things that have higher value and let the others go to Bangladesh. That's fine. And train the workers, have higher education, and eventually become innovative, right? Which is kind of where they're at with the 14th five-year plan. Is now we're at the frontiers and we want to be able to have our own innovation. And all of that is what we would recommend countries to do. But at the same time, it seems that on the political side or the social side, there's like Susan Shirk said, this fragile superpower, that there's something very worrisome from the leadership's point of view, that the economy has moved more towards market in many sectors and in many ways, and they've moved up the value chain. They've been very successful, and at the same time, then the leaders seem scared of all these things that you just mentioned. And
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion right now, of course, of this dual circulation theory, which, and I mean, it is worth considering, and there is discussion in the American academic community about, how much of this is coming from initiated by China and how much of it is a reaction to things that others are doing, for example, the United States. So when we see discussion of the dual circulation theory, a lot of people are looking very closely at this. They're trying to decode it, which is also always very difficult. But, the general consensus seems to be that this is a way of covering a move toward, self-reliance, really. And, more, as you mentioned, indigenous innovation, but also relying on our own consumer market, not being dependent on the outside, et cetera, et cetera. Well, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that in part because they've, been threatened now by the United States in many of these areas through our entity listings and export controls and threats to try to contain their economy, et cetera. And so they're doing what, in the face of those kinds of threats, what might be seen as a pretty reasonable response of trying to diversify away, trying to build in resilience, et cetera. All the things that, most economies are now saying in the wake of the pandemic that they should be doing. So, how much of this is, the other thing about dual circulation, I mean, we have been begging China to rely more, move away from this export-driven economy and more toward this consumption-led model. And so now they're doing that, but now we're seeing all kinds of shades of, malintent behind it. And, it's just, it's a very complicated picture. And I think we often are quick to assume some kind of malign or nefarious intent, when if you look at the whole picture, you would see actually that there are a lot of things that are just rational responses going on. But it's very hard to separate this out. And of course, the, kind of prevailing narrative that we have and the media environment doesn't really lend itself to this kind of nuanced analytical discussion, right? So the soundbite or the first thing that pops up becomes sort of the dominant narrative, and then it's very hard to turn. So I think, China has brought some of this on itself. There's no question about that. And they've not been always very skillful at arguing their side or communicating or within their public diplomacy, et cetera. And I think, one of the things we could maybe say is that a lot of people, while the U.S. was sort of preoccupied with this isolationist, unilateralist drive under President Trump, people said, well, China's like moving into the space that is being left by the United States. But in fact, China has not done as well as they might have done if they had been a little bit more skillful with their diplomacy in some of these areas. So I think we both have things to answer for. I think the public narrative has really gone pretty far now, so it's going to be hard to just self-correct. It's going to take some effort and some time and some, kind of pragmatic outreach on to try to get some points on the board on the sort of positive side of the ledger, if that's possible.
Yeah, on the innovation side, the new 14th five-year plan has many mentions of innovation, but it also has many mentions of security and national security, building national security, and technology. And from our side, with the export controls, and now even this week, the Trump executive order for US investors not to invest in 31 companies, and that list could increase for, easily. My concern is that there are certainly areas where the US should protect technology that's really important to our national defense, and pay more attention to that than we have in the past. But the way that innovation works these days is that it's very cooperative, and there's comparative advantage all over the world and expertise, and they come together and they create new ideas and new technology, and all of it because of the internet, the AI pieces might be considered national security. Right, the whole digital, anything that's digital is potentially used in the military. And so we really need to figure out a way to isolate what part of that innovation needs to be done close to our chests, and the rest can be done openly. Otherwise, we're going to lose our technological edge too.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think the connections between economics and technology and national security are being overdrawn. Certainly, there are some technologies that are sensitive. That's always been the case. I mean, that's why we had this COCOM export control regime in the time of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But the problem now, as you mentioned, is that military and civilian are basically the same. I mean, we have civ-mil fusion. This is something we always hold up as a bogeyman on the part of China. But I mean, this is the fact around the world that dual use items are very prevalent now in the military. And clearly not all technologies are equally sensitive. And we need narrow targeting of the most sensitive technologies. And we cannot aspire to create this zero risk environment that we seem to be going for now. I mean, that is just too expensive. So we need to maintain open access to technology platforms. And we, of all people in the world, we are the United States of America, we're for openness. We should avoid creating a world of separate technology zones. This will be incredibly debilitating. We need to maintain access, open access to common platforms. This is what we need for our sort of commercial and economic future, our spiritual and cultural future. All of our inherent advantages would rely on that. But right now, really, no one seems willing to compromise. We could end up in the worst of all worlds with a sort of a US-based platform, a EU-based platform, and a China-based platform. And I'm not sure that ours would be the largest, have the largest area if that was the case. So I really think the US is farther behind in thinking about this in some ways than either the EU or China, because we have left it in the hands of the private sector and not done much regulation. And it seems to me that, the train has already left the station in some ways in Europe and in China, and we need to get in the game.
Yeah, well, this definitely should be part of the Biden administration's story, as you say, that somehow pull together the benefits of this openness and cooperation with China is just one of the pieces, right? As you suggested with the allies, it's best to work with allies in a broad sense, not our allies against China.
Right.
Because that's going to create lots of problems, obviously. And so if somehow the Biden administration could create the story where America's open to work with the world again, and then put a technology spin on that, put a political spin on that, put a climate change spin on that, then maybe that would work.
Right. I mean, I do think that, and this gets to a much bigger theme than US-China, but I do think that, we never really had a conversation in this country about, what we were doing in the world when the Soviet Union collapsed. We just kind of went into this democracy promotion and interventionist and unipolar superpower mode. And I do think that now the Biden administration has a chance to kind of have that conversation. But the problem is we're faced with so many domestic challenges and people are so preoccupied with those that it's probably not going to happen. And, until we really come up with what our vision is, I think it's very hard for us to get back into the game of what we should be doing and all sort of pulling in the same direction. And there's certainly a lack of consensus in the country right now, obviously, about U.S. Purpose in the world and what we should be doing out there. So I and the U.S.-China relationship is a big part of that, but it's also going to be carried along by, what happens in that space, one way or the other.
Yeah. Now, one of the tricky pieces, of course, from the U.S. point of view is human rights. And you've mentioned that in a number of contexts, but that would also, the Biden administration has to navigate that issue. And, how is it that an administration can show they care about human rights, because they do, but also not say, well, unless, things change in Xinjiang, we're not going to talk to you or something. There has to be some way to cast that story. And it in other parts of the world as well. It's not just in China, but it's how do you say, well, yes, that's important, but we set it aside for now. Or
I really hope our diplomacy doesn't start to follow the way we're behaving now domestically, which is that if I don't like you, I don't talk to you, because that has been a creeping feature of our diplomacy, sort of holding conversation hostage and thinking that somehow that's going to produce the result that you want. And I don't think it ever has. So I would definitely counsel staying away from drawing these red lines and getting in a huff and taking your toys and going and going home. On human rights, I mean, the Biden administration is going to pay attention to this. It is a core part of our foreign policy and of who we are as a nation, obviously. We need to return to first principles, and human rights and being a human rights defender is part of that for sure. But I think, Biden's been at this a long time. He's seen, the mistakes that we've made, as well as the advances and victories we've been able to count. And I think he understands the need for pragmatic patience on this. China is, a major power in the world. It's a proud country with a long-standing tradition and history and culture. Different system from ours. It's certainly not perfect, but nobody is. I think the thing to focus on is that China has signed up to certain international rules and standards, and those are certainly relevant, both for China's own reputation, but also for our expectations and treatment of China going forward. So we can raise human rights issues bilaterally, and we do, and we should. And I've always been a proponent of the human rights dialogue, even though it infuriates the people that have to participate in it. And I have been one of those people on the other side of the table. But I still think it's very important to listen to what the Chinese say they're doing, and then to talk about what we perceive them doing. I mean, this is, if you're not with two such different systems, if we're not doing that, then we're just getting nowhere. And so, as frustrating as it may be, we have to do that. But also the multilateral arena is really key to human rights issues because, it is a matter of China's governance, most of these issues. And if you don't want to make it one country's, against another, you want to have it, couch it in terms of international rules and standards, and that China needs to live up to its commitments and try to press through the multilateral venues. But in the end, I think the thing we have to realize on the human rights account is that China is going to need to make these changes itself. And, sanctions and penalties can do two things. They can make us feel good because we did something, and they can, stop some actor from getting some piece of equipment or some monetary transaction or something, but they're not very good at actually changing behavior of a government. So as long as we're clear about what we think we're going to get from doing these penalties, and as long as they don't cost too much, I suppose you can do it. But there are costs to these things, and it's not likely to have the desired effect. So I think, I'm not as enthusiastic about sanctions in response to everything as a lot of people are now currently in both the Congress, but also the students in my classes at Yale, because what I see is these measures just make other governments, and not just the Chinese government. I've worked with a lot of governments around the world, and they tend to just dig in when you do things like this. So I would be a proponent of working more pragmatically and constructively on these issues with an eye toward it's going to take a while and they need to come to it on their own.
Yeah. Well, one more topic before we open it up to the audience. There's a range of opinions, it seems, at the moment, and analyses about how assertive or aggressive China really is in Asia in particular. Is China expansionist or not? And it goes from no, it's not and hasn't been historically to yes, it's terribly aggressive and it's going to take over the world kind of analyses. And you talked about, China being, not great behavior in certain aspects of the South China Sea with the islands, of course, and so other kinds of actions in Asia in particular. What is your take in terms of how expansionist China is behaving now and what you expect in the future?
Yeah, this is the favorite, Washington sort of cocktail hour conversation or academic roundtable conversation. And frankly, nobody really knows because China's power is growing and its interests as its power grows are going to expand. And, that's in some respects natural and legitimate because, they're protecting and defending, their expanding set of interests. So I think, if you talk about, is it China's intention to take over the world? I tend to be pretty skeptical of a statement like that. But I do think that it is likely that China's interests are going to expand and that it is going to protect them, and that it's very hard for us to predict how far that's going to go because we really can't say for sure the trajectory of China's, power increase and evolution over time. So I do like to focus on China's behavior, but what I would say is that China, to me, and Yahweh probably has strong views on this, and others as well. But to me, the refrain that I hear in talking to Chinese counterparts, the subtext of it is, we just want to be respected. And they feel that they have not been respected. They have not been acknowledged as a legitimate major power. They are treated as different. And, and this relates to history and insecurities about the legitimacy of their system, et cetera. It's very hard for the US in our system to confer this legitimacy and this respect. So, to me, that's really a key question that really has been left open every time there's a new administration that comes into office in the United States. We have this debate over how are we going to call the US-China relationship, and we can never, call it something that the Chinese want it to be called, because we can't, confer that level of sort of equality or whatever you want to call it. So I think, that is kind of a central issue in the relationship that remains to be resolved. But I'd be curious to hear what you think about that.
Well, I think that however we decide that relationship is, how expansion is, then our response would be determined by that. So if we think China is an existential threat, then we're going to build up military and make kind of assumptions about countering that. So, and that can be very dangerous if it's wrong.
Well, I don't see how China constitutes an existential threat to the United States. I just don't see that.
Yeah.
That's not my position, and I look with skepticism upon people who say that it's an existential threat to the United States and our way of life. And it's, these kinds of things that keep being said.
Yeah, but those are out there, right?
Yeah, but I don't think there's much justification for it.
I agree, but I think that characterization then becomes part of the story, and so it's something that's it's really important to get right, or at least be patient, as you're suggesting, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is this sort of effort at mobilization. And I'm not sure how compelling it is for people outside the DC Beltway, at least. I don't think most people think of China as, being that much of that they're out to sort of alter the US, system and way of life. I find it a little bit, I think people outside of DC find that far-fetched. Now,
yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out here in the question and answer.
All right, Yahweh, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Susan and Penny, for this very engaging and informative conversation. Let's just move away from US-China, because I have my entire class. You mentioned your students at Yale. So the students are probably interested in, foreign service. How do you deal with Chinese diplomats? How do you interact with them? And for those students who aspire to be future diplomats, what do you say to them? That, go for it. What is the most exhilarating part of being a diplomat?
Oh, you mean to be a U.S. diplomat? Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I mean, I loved my foreign service career. I mean, I just think it's the best job you could possibly have in the world. And the reason, I didn't get into it because of politics or activism or anything. I just liked exploring foreign cultures, foreign languages. I found that it was really important for me to live in a place in order to understand it. So, it became very natural to me to think of, going into the foreign service would be great. The other thing I loved was that you can be a generalist. And, as a person who always wanted to avoid studying for a PhD, I thought this is perfect. I get to basically start a new PhD every 3 years when I move to a new country, and then I never have to actually write that dissertation. So you can really go deep and study a new place, a new culture, meet new people. And, you know, it's very rewarding. All over the world, with a few exceptions, and very, very few exceptions. I mean, people are very welcoming of Americans, even official Americans, even, you know, if they have problems with the US government. You can do so much good by being, you know, a strong and energetic, you know, kind of supporter and advocate out there on the front lines, talking about what the U.S. government is doing and talking about, you know, what the U.S. government is doing with the host country. It's just a fantastic career, and they taught me 2 years of intensive Chinese language. So there's a lot of benefits to be had if you're interested in sort of languages and travel. And of course, you know, you come back to Washington, D.C. and you get to be at the center of the policy-making whirlwind there and see up close how the sausage gets made, which is also fascinating, if a little frustrating at times. But I think, you know, and the thing I will say is, and Yahweh can back me up on this, I mean, the colleagues you have in the Foreign Service are just some of the best people you'll ever meet in the whole world. And I miss them all every day. My State Department and other Foreign Service, other agency colleagues at embassies or being back in Washington, it's just a great group of people to spend your life with. So I couldn't recommend it more. I don't know, you know, I mean, maybe we have foreign citizens watching that want to think about joining their diplomatic service. I must say that the Chinese diplomats are some of the best I've ever met. They are very good at their jobs. They work very hard, and they do a good job representing their country. And you know, I still keep in touch with a lot of them on WeChat. You know, they're tremendous resources and terrific counterparts in human beings. And so I just think it's a great area to devote your life to.
Thank you for that answer. We do have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'm sort of going to group them together. So the one question is on the trade war. So will the Biden administration unilaterally or in negotiation with China to bilaterally eliminate the tariff? Where do you see phase 2 of the trade negotiation? And third, China and other countries signed RCEP. You know, will this impact U.S. calculation and decision in the area of trade?
Yeah, these are great questions. These are questions that everyone in Asia is asking me, and also questions that are really hard for me to answer because, you know, President-elect Biden on trade has a pretty tough road to hoe, I would say. You know, the American population is pretty skeptical at this point of trade, of kind of globalization, of dealing with the after effects of globalization, mitigating the effects of globalization has been a big theme on the campaign trail, and it's going to continue to be a big theme here. So, you know, I think that obviously Joe Biden has been a proponent of free trade in the past, certainly. He's now got to deal with domestic constituencies that are skeptical and a Congress that is probably going to be skeptical. So I think he will look to work on trade with China. I think the phase 1 trade deal needs some surgery, and probably both China and the US, the new Biden administration at least, will feel that needs to be looked at and discussed. Certainly, the Biden administration would be more interested in a phase 2 type of discussion with China than the phase 1 managed trade type deal that was negotiated. So, and there was discussions with the Chinese ongoing under the Obama administration. They didn't get concluded, but they got close to being concluded. And the Trump administration had taken some of those issues up as part of a potential phase 2. So I think that could continue. I don't think this is going to be the first thing out of the box, though. And I'm not sure that the tariffs that are currently on China are going to be adjusted immediately. Maybe there will be some small adjustment early on, but not a big adjustment. I think that the tariffs that are most likely to come off first are going to be the 232 tariffs on steel, which hit basically everybody, including our allies. So that's not mainly aimed at China. And so we'll just have to see, how quickly he engages with China on trade. I mean, I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, the first kinds of moves are going to be in trying to sort of consolidate more the relationships with the allies that have been undermined in the last few years and try to get things straightened out there first. But I think a discussion with China on trade will certainly have to come. I would advocate that it continues. You have to say that the one thing under the Trump administration that did sort of surprise is that Robert Lighthizer, who started off as the biggest anti-China hawk, became the biggest defender of this phase 1 trade agreement and good friend of Liu He by the end. And he, I'm sure, in the course of all those conversations, learned a lot about the Chinese system and the Chinese economy and the realities of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what you get from a negotiation, that you don't get in just a dialogue. If you're negotiating with someone, it's a mutual education session, really. And you're learning a lot about the nuts and bolts of how things really work and what are the real constraints. And I think that should continue. But I can't say that it's going to produce early fruit. I know the question about RCEP, this was a negotiation long in the works. And I think it's, certainly important for the region that it got to be concluded. I know the countries in the region that were party to it are quite happy about it. It was supposed to be that was going on at the same time as the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was the APEC-based trade liberalization agreement that was being negotiated simultaneously with RCEP. Of course, the U.S. dropped out of that under Trump on the first day of his administration. It was, salvaged by the CPTPP 11. But, now we have these 2 trade agreements in Asia, and the U.S. isn't in either one of them. And I think that is not an ideal situation, just to put it mildly.
Just as a segue, because you talk about RCEP, India at one time was part of RCEP, decided to drop out. So we have a question from Henry Yu asking about the trilateral China, US, India relationship, in consideration of the recent clash between India and China. Well, when you were still at the State Department, when Secretary Tillerson gave a speech at CSIS talking about the bonding between Washington and New Delhi seemed aimed at pushing India to be closer to the U.S. and part of the containment of China. Where do you see this trilateral relationship going?
Yeah, so I was definitely still in the State Department when we put forward the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. Mm-hmm. And my way of thinking about that strategy was that it was mostly a kind of a continuation of the process that had started under the Obama administration with the rebalance to the Asia Pacific. And the idea was, the US joined the East Asia Summit, and we became more involved in the architecture in East Asia. But part of that was also the idea was to get India more involved in East Asian issues because they had tended to be fairly, self-isolated and not really engaged much in the East Asia arena. And so, the Indo-Pacific strategy was, the Quad, actually, this arrangement between the US, Japan, Australia, and India had started under the Obama administration, then run into trouble when the Indians didn't want the Australians to participate, et cetera. But I think that the courting of India and bringing India more into the East Asian kind of arena is going to be a very long process, but one that most US governments in the future, and I think including the Biden administration, will continue to work on. It's not going to bear fruit quickly. I think people who were following the RCEP negotiation process were probably not that surprised that India ended up dropping out. Because, now with India out of RCEP, India's really, they're not engaged now in that framework. They're not in APEC. So they're really just in the EAS, and then there's the Quad, and, it's been hard to get them to sort of engage. And I think we'll keep working on that, but I don't think that India wants to sign up with the US for an anti-China kind of approach. And I don't think that the Quad, the Japan, US, Australia, India grouping should even be seen as an anti-China grouping. Really, it's more about trying to get India in than it is about trying to face off against China. I don't think that it's going to be successful as a sort of an anti-China grouping. But I think that this, trying to get, US-India relations have really been, long. I remember when under the Bush administration, Nick Burns was trying to get the 1-2-3 agreement for civilian nuclear cooperation with India. So we've been working on the US-India relationship for a long time, and it's coming along, it's improving, but it's very slow. And I think getting India into East Asia will also come along, but it will also be very slow. But I think we'll keep going on it.
This next question has, a lot of audience actually are concerned is the Justice Department China initiative. It's to many of us, it's racial profiling. And Christopher Wray, director of FBI, in his speech said every 10 hours, they open investigation of ethnic Chinese. Do you see that will continue to be at the Justice Department, or Biden administration may review it and probably fold it?
This is a very good question. I think that this FBI looking at what foreign researchers and particularly Chinese researchers, what they might be doing and what kinds of economic espionage might be happening had really also picked up before the Trump administration. But I think, unfortunately, under the Trump administration, it became this kind of this flag or this propaganda push, very public, named the China Initiative. That was new. And I think that was unfortunate. I think the Biden administration will certainly, they will keep up the efforts to look for anyone who may be engaged in espionage or anyone who may be engaged in inappropriate conduct, but they will get away from labeling it, associating it with a particular country, i.e. China. And I think they will play down the public kind of campaign aspect of it, which I think has been, Maggie Lewis has written at Seton Hall, has written a lot on this, that it's really kind of outside of the bounds of what we would normally think of as kind of our rule of law principles, let's put it that way. And certainly it has tagged the Asian American community, not just the Chinese American community, but the whole Asian American community with a brush of suspicion, which has led to some really horrifying outcomes. And I think that the Biden administration in general is going to be much more sort of principled on these kinds of issues and go back to basics. So I don't think it's going to fold or go away completely, but certainly the character of it will be changed and it will be put into proper context.
Thanks. The next question is from Ray Wang. If you remember, he traveled with you and me through the provinces, and he now is the librarian of the University of New Orleans. And he asked me to convey his best regards to you, and hopefully you'll be able to travel to New Orleans. His question is, talking about U.S.-China cooperation, can you give a specific example where, both leaders and people think, this is where we can actually cooperate and how? For example, if you say North Korea, what will U.S. want China do in resolving this? Or pandemic, can U.S. and China really cooperate on fighting the virus? Here at the domestic U.S. battle, or that cooperation has to happen just like Ebola? It has to happen outside the U.S., given how toxic the atmosphere here is in terms of the negative view of China.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because when we say U.S.-China cooperation, oftentimes what we really mean is kind of parallel efforts toward the same goal, where an area where we have overlapping interests, where we're both going for the same goal, and we want to both work in a parallel direction in order to achieve that goal. And we call that cooperation when, in fact, it may or may not involve actual material cooperation, but it's more like coordination. So we saw this, for example, in, I think, the Ebola outbreak, where, the U.S. contributed certain things to the efforts to mitigate that outbreak in Africa. China contributed certain things. We coordinated on what we were each doing. In some cases, U.S. troops helped offload Chinese planes and things like that. So that was real material cooperation. But in general, it was mostly parallel and coordinated. So on an issue like the pandemic, I certainly wouldn't anticipate having, Chinese doctors fly in a plane and start dispensing vaccines here. But what I do think would be very important, and, it's true that even back in the 60s, I think it was, the US and the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War undertook a joint effort to eradicate smallpox in sort of the developing world, and sent, doctors also, I think, in parallel, but, mobilized resources for vaccines and sent, groups out to try to not develop the vaccines, but distribute the vaccines. And I think that kind of an effort with respect to the pandemic in the developing world could happen. Of course, we've got to deal with the pandemic at home first, before we could, presumably, before we could contribute to that kind of an effort. But I think on vaccine development and on vaccine distribution, even more so, I would think that the US and China would both have a ton of resources that they would be able to contribute to making sure a vaccine can be rolled out around the world, in an efficient way. On climate change is the other place where people keep talking about cooperation. And really, there are several different avenues on climate change. One is kind of a mutual pressuring, which we call cooperation, and really isn't cooperation, but it again is this area where we have a mutual interest and we're trying to do parallel efforts to reach that goal, and we pressure each other really to undertake those efforts. But then there's also areas for cooperation and technology development on climate change, I think, where we've worked together and teams of researchers to do research on things like carbon capture, sequestration, other things that would help all of us in being able to mitigate climate change.
Thank you. The next question is a big one. many in the audience have raised this is China's red line, Taiwan. Potential skirmishes between U.S. and China in the South China Sea can be contained. But the issue on Taiwan, and you probably noticed Secretary Pompeo recently mentioned Taiwan has never been part of China. And this is forcing China into, I would call it a war-making mode, if this is going to escalate. How this is going to be contained and what American interest is being served for, U.S., this is from the audience, for U.S., to keep this, we are going to defend Taiwan regardless of causes or, what is going to happen in the coming years. So how this is going to be managed so that U.S. and China do not get into a war?
It needs to be managed better, is what I would say, from both sides. And we talk about our one China policy. China talks about the one China principle. We talk about the catechism of commitments that the U.S. has made with respect to the normalization in 1979, which you, Yahweh Liu, have great familiarity with, and which President Carter was actually involved in. Most of the issues surrounding the normalization had to do with Taiwan, actually. So, it's clear to any government official in the United States that this is, the key issue for China. And I think people in the Trump administration do know that. President Trump himself even does understand that, I believe. And certainly people in the Biden administration who have been around the horn for years in foreign policy circles in the US do understand this. I mean, the real question is, how far can all of those original understandings take us in dealing with a question, the nature of which has so fundamentally changed from 1979 till now? And I think, we really need to sit down and have some very serious conversations about, how we can make sure that this issue develops in a way that doesn't immutably damage the interests of China and immutably damage the interests of the US or both of us. And certainly the US wants to avoid conflict. I think China wants to avoid conflict over this issue. But how is this issue going to be managed going forward in a way that, is not going to upset the work of the last 40 years of all of us, I think needs to be discussed. I mean, the US takes very seriously its role, and certainly the US Congress in particular takes very seriously its feeling that it is kind of the anointed protector of the people on Taiwan, and all that they have accomplished in their vibrant democracy and their very strong society, et cetera. And of course, that is not appreciated by people in China or government officials in China who see that they have a completely different idea with respect to how things should go in the future with respect to Taiwan. So I think this is a very hard issue. It's extremely complicated. I think in the Biden administration, you will be dealing with people on this question who will operate in good faith in trying to preserve stability and preserve the status quo. So I think we will be moving to a better place on Taiwan if we can get through the next couple of months. I don't, to be honest, think that the current team has always been operating in good faith on this issue, especially recently. But I hope that we can show enough restraint to get through to a period when, and I think the sort of behavior of the Biden administration so far, the president-elect and his team, on this issue, even so far since the election, has demonstrated that they have a certain amount of understanding of the gravity of this issue. But, the U.S. certainly feels a great responsibility to people on Taiwan, and that's not going to change either.
All right, we're getting to the end of today's presentation, the town hall, so to speak. So one quick question and one bigger one for you to wrap up. The quick question is, one audience asked about the Confucius Institute, but it leads to the question is, do you think China has this coordinated, united front approach to try to penetrate American campuses, state level government, state legislator, and Confucius Institute is a spy agency? Is that paranoia, or is that a real threat posed by China?
Well, I personally would say that I don't believe that is the case. Do some people believe that is the case? Perhaps. Are some people using that to make a political point? Probably. But I think the problem really is that China and the Chinese government has shown increasing levels of sensitivity to criticism, increasing interest in finding out who outside the borders of China is criticizing the government, and is going to greater lengths than ever before to try to gather that information and to pressure people as a result of that information. And I think that is of great concern to people. So, I think as long as, and I have a lot of trouble with the fuzziness of US analysis of this problem, frankly. And I think, Confucius Institutes are mostly just helpful purveyors of Chinese language and culture availability. And I think that in a couple of cases, there may have been some things that people did that wasn't exactly in keeping with their charter, and you can look into those matters and you can, correct them or whatever. The main issue is transparency. If people have a feeling that someone has an agenda that's not explicitly stated and is working that agenda unbeknownst to the people that are concerned, then people feel that is, a transgression of some kind. And I do think that, the United Front and all of these organizations do not always operate completely transparently. That's probably because they're not used to operating transparently. And it's not because they're trying to necessarily hide anything, but it's just a kind of a way of doing things. And it has gotten them into some trouble, I would say. Now, certainly there are probably cases where people are bribing legislators. I mean, there are things that people do that are wrong, and those should be looked into, and people should be held accountable, and they should be exposed. But I think, the transparency of what different organizations are doing, where they're getting funding, what kinds of things they are, keeping tabs on, et cetera, would be helpful to dispel the notion that this is such a widespread phenomenon and that it's all about, underhanded, malign influence, et cetera, which I don't subscribe to that, but I think we need to undertake some rigorous reform of practices in order to dispel that impression.
All right, that brings us to the final question. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that President-elect Biden has a very realistic view of China. That reminds me of what he said in Iowa and earlier. He said, come on, China is not going to steal our lunch. And then he started talking about corruption in China, the mountains in the west and oceans on the east. I think what he's trying to say is that there is no existential threat posed by China to the American way of life. So quick answers, yes or no answer is, do you believe that actually should be the perception of American leaders? The longer answer required from you is, you think the American leaders will one day sit down with the Chinese leader and say, we don't like your system. However, we do believe that system, particularly starting in 1979, all the way to now, 42 years, that system has delivered for the Chinese people. That system has also made China a better country, made US a richer country, and made this world a better place, that we are going to reconcile with that system. Hopefully with the difference in the system, we could still work together, make both of our countries better, and this place a more beautiful, more comfortable place.
Okay, let me take the second one first. I think that actually under the Obama Biden administration, that actually happened already. So I don't think that would be a stretch to think that could happen again. It would be harder to have it happen now because of what's happened now in the last 4 years, and because of the deterioration in the relationship, obviously, and the public rhetoric around all of it. But I think that essentially what you said, I mean, not word for word, of course, but the idea of it was conveyed under Obama, in settings with the top leadership of China. So that could happen again, I hope, I assume. The first question, what was it again?
It's the realistic view of China. China is so bogged down by domestic tension issues that China never will, and certainly is not posing an existential threat to the US supremacy and to the global order by the same token.
Yeah. So to me, when Joe Biden says things like, China's not going to eat our lunch, what he's saying is that I am confident in the system that the American way of life has developed, and I am confident that we can continue to thrive even in the face of competition with China. That's how, and he thinks we can prevail. I mean, he thinks the system in the US is resilient and dynamic, and he has confidence in it, as opposed maybe to the way that President Trump, portrayed the competition, which was much more sort of dire and dramatic and, as you say, a threat to our way of life, et cetera. So I think that's really the difference. It's really coming from more of a place of what are they seeking to and aiming to emphasize about America, as opposed to what it is they're seeing as inadequate or something in what China's doing. But certainly Joe Biden spent a lot of time in China, and he knows the challenges that China faces. And I'm sure that he probably has, which I don't know if Trump has any real feeling for the China's internal situation and the challenges that Chinese leaders would face realistically. So I think Biden is talking about both of those things. Whereas Trump is choosing to sort of emphasize they're coming to get us, and it's more of a mobilization tactic is the way I read it. But if that answers your question.
It does. On behalf of the China Research Center, Penny, the founding director, and Han Chao, the current director, on behalf of my students, people in the greater Atlanta community, and people in China and in other parts of the US. We thank you, Susan, for your great analysis of the current relationship and where this relationship is going to go. I think the audience, right now we still have 122, agree with me that there will be a new page, and we should be little bit more optimistic and with a strong conviction that this relationship has to be managed well. Otherwise, all of us are going to suffer from mismanagement. So thank you again. And
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Yeah,
Thank you, Han Chao. Good to see you.
Good to see you virtually.
Virtually. Good to be with all of you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'll also send all the Q&A questions to everyone because I think they're great questions, and it will be good for us to look at the questions and continue to think about the relationship. Thank you,
I
Sarah.
agree.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Good night.
Good
Bye,
night.
Susan.
Bye.
Bye.